Not perfume, not gasoline, not even the sweet scent of leather from the car's aging interior. It was something else, faint, foreign, unmistakably male. A cologne he didn't wear. One morning Jack slid into the driver's seat to move the SUV from the driveway and caught it. The air was thick with something that didn't belong. He sat there for a moment, fingers frozen on the gear shift, heart suddenly unsure of its pace. At first, he chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe Claire had given a coworker a ride home. Maybe the scent had lingered from the car wash or a valet. But deep down, something shifted. They'd been married 13 years. 2 kids. A shared mortgage. Shared calendars. Shared exhaustion. Jack wasn't the type to leap to conclusions. He was calm by nature, deliberate in thought, the kind of man who fixed leaking faucets himself and still bought flowers for anniversaries even when things were strained. But that morning, parked in front of their beige, neatly trimmed suburban home on Alder Creek Lane, something inside him stirred. Claire had taken the car in for service twice that month. He remembered because he'd asked her both times if she wanted him to go instead. She'd waved him off with a tight smile, said she had it covered. No big deal. Just a squeaky brake pad, she'd said the first time. Battery issue, the second. Both times she returned late, hair slightly tousled, her expression distant. When he asked how it went, she said, "Fine," and disappeared upstairs. Jack hadn't pushed. Not then. He watched the little signs collect like dust across the edges of their life. Claire's phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, now lived in her purse or back pocket. She'd started leaving the dinner table before anyone was done, brushing Lily's hand off her arm when their daughter wanted to show her a drawing. Evan, their 9-year-old, had asked twice last week if Mom was mad at him. Jack didn't know how to answer. At night, the bed felt colder. Claire rolled to the far edge, always with her back to him. When he reached for her, she mumbled that she was tired. Stress at work. Long days. That he should understand. He tried to. But understanding had limits. Then came the t-shirt. It was late Saturday morning when he found it, stuffed halfway under the passenger seat, balled up like someone had tried to hide it. Jack had been vacuuming the car while the kids rode their bikes in the driveway. At first, he thought it was one of Evan's old gym shirts, but when he unfolded it, the truth settled in like ice in his bloodstream. It wasn't Evan's. It wasn't his. The size was a large, but not the brand he wore. The scent was familiar now, the same cologne from before. Strong. Cheap. Unmistakably bold. Jack stood there, the vacuum's hum still droning behind him, the shirt limp in his hand. For a second, the world narrowed. Just the shirt. The driveway. The sound of his daughter's laughter echoing down the sidewalk like a reminder of a time that already felt distant. He didn't say anything right away. Not to Claire. Not to the kids. Instead, he folded the shirt carefully, almost tenderly, and slipped it into a paper bag he tucked in the garage behind the tool chest. Proof. Or maybe just a question waiting for the right moment. Claire didn't notice. Or pretended not to. She came home later than usual that day, her smile worn thin like an old coat. Jack watched her kiss the kids on the head without looking them in the eyes, watched her move through the house like she was already somewhere else. The worst part wasn't the shirt. It wasn't the smell of another man, or the late nights, or the sudden bursts of irritation that had become Claire's second language. It was the way their children had begun to shrink in her presence. Lily, just 6, now sought out Jack instead of her mother when she was scared. Evan no longer waited up to say goodnight. They were learning, slowly, painfully, what distance felt like. And they were too young to call it by name. Jack knew then that something was coming. Something he could no longer deny. He didn't know who the man was, not yet. But he was real. He had a scent. A shirt. A name, somewhere. Jack would find it. Not for revenge. Not even for justice. But because the truth, once it begins to leak through the seams, has a way of soaking everything it touches. Jack didn't confront her. Not yet. He wasn't the type to storm the gates without knowing who was on the other side. Instead, he watched. Not like a predator, more like a man trying to map the shape of a storm before it tore his house apart. He took note of everything, the frequency of her appointments, the shifting details of her stories, the time stamps on her returns. Each inconsistency etched a little deeper into his mind. 3 weeks. That's how long it took before she mentioned the garage again. She dropped it casually over breakfast, stirring her coffee like she wasn't aware she'd already said this exact line before. I need to take the car back in. That knocking sound still there when I hit the brakes. Jack didn't flinch. He nodded. Took a sip of his own coffee. Let the lie settle between them like steam on the kitchen window. The garage she mentioned wasn't the one they'd used for years. It was new. Some place on the edge of town. She said it was faster, cheaper. Jack doubted both. That afternoon, when Claire left, he waited exactly 13 minutes. Long enough for her to think she was free. Then he called out to the kids, told them he had an errand, and climbed into his truck. The repair shop sat at the end of a gravel lot off Camden Road, sandwiched between an old feed store and a chain-link fence choked in ivy. The sign was half-lit, the kind of place that didn't need to advertise because it survived on word of mouth. Jack pulled into the lot and killed the engine. His hands were steady, but his heart tapped against his ribs like a warning. From his truck he could see the shop's front office, one large window, blinds drawn halfway. Claire's SUV was there, parked crooked near the garage bay. She wasn't in the waiting room. Jack scanned the property and spotted her on the side of the building, near the employee entrance. She wasn't alone. The man was taller than Jack, arms sleeved in grease and tattoos, black hair tucked under a backward ball cap. He stood too close, his stance too casual for someone discussing brake pads. Claire had her back to Jack, but her posture betrayed her, one hip leaned toward the man, her hand briefly brushing his wrist as he handed her something. Jack didn't get out of the truck. He sat there, letting the scene burn into his mind like a photograph he'd never hang but could never forget. Every suspicion confirmed not by words, but by angles. Gestures. Silences that echoed louder than any scream. He drove home in silence, arriving just in time to catch Evan on the porch, waiting with a soccer ball tucked under one arm. His face lit up when he saw his dad, but that glow dimmed when he asked if Mom was coming too. Jack forced a smile, said she'd be back soon. Claire came home 2 hours later. She didn't mention the mechanic. She didn't say what took so long. Just walked past Jack and the kids with a distracted kiss on Lily's hair and a muttered apology about traffic. She went upstairs before dinner. Said she wasn't hungry. Jack made grilled cheese and tomato soup that night. Lily spilled her juice and cried. Evan sat in silence, poking at the crusts. Jack tried to make them laugh, but it all felt thin, stretched over something broken and pretending not to be. Later that evening, as he tucked Lily into bed, she whispered the words that would haunt him for weeks. Why doesn't Mommy listen anymore? He didn't know how to answer. So he kissed her forehead and sat beside her until she drifted off. Then he went back downstairs, poured himself a drink, and sat at the kitchen table long after the lights were off, staring into the dark. The mechanic had a name. Jack would learn it soon. But what hurt more than betrayal was realizing how easily love could go silent. Not all at once, but in stages. Like the lights dimming in a house you used to call home. Jack waited until Monday. He waited because he needed to breathe, to think, to let the fog of that parking lot encounter settle into clarity. Anger had tried to rise in him, loud, volcanic, but he pushed it down. Rage wasn't what this called for. Not yet. He needed facts. Something concrete. Something that couldn't be dismissed as jealousy or insecurity. Claire had left a receipt on the passenger seat by accident. Jack found it the next morning, a smudged carbon copy from Denton Auto Repair. Scrawled across the bottom, under a $63 charge for a tire rotation, was a name, Dean R. That was all it took. A Google search led to a business listing. Jack clicked through to a web page with stock images of wrenches and happy customers. Then a photo. Dean Rivera. Owner. Mechanic. Smirking in a button-down shirt that couldn't quite hide the tattoo creeping up his neck. Jack stared at the screen for a long time. He studied the man's face, his posture, the careless confidence in his eyes. He felt nothing. Not yet. Just an aching clarity. Dean was the one. He didn't ask Claire about it. Didn't bring up the receipt or the shirt or the unmistakable scent of a man who didn't belong in their life. Instead, Jack did what he'd always done, he paid attention. And Claire? She continued to unravel. Her temper had changed lately. Sharp edges where there used to be curves. The kids noticed it too. Evan had stopped asking her to help with his homework. Lily no longer reached for her hand on walks. Claire seemed unaware. Or maybe she was aware and simply didn't care. She snapped at Evan over a spilled glass of milk on Tuesday. Jack watched from across the room as her voice rose higher than it needed to. Evan shrank into himself, eyes wide, the sting of shame more visible than the wet stain on the floor. Jack cleaned it up in silence while Claire stormed off. That night, he heard her on the phone in the bathroom. Whispering. Laughing once, soft and low, like the sound she used to make with him years ago. The shower was running, but she wasn't in it. Her silhouette was visible through the frosted glass, fully dressed, pacing back and forth. Jack sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the closed door, each muffled word confirming what his gut already knew. He didn't sleep. At 3 a.m., he got up, went into the garage, and opened the paper bag where he'd kept the t-shirt. He held it again, turning it over in his hands like some relic of a different reality. There was a faint stain near the collar. Motor oil? Sweat? Jack didn't know. But it was real. Just like Dean. Just like the distance growing between Claire and their children. The next day, Jack picked the kids up early from school and took them to the park. It wasn't a grand gesture, just time. Time to be near them. To listen. Evan kicked the soccer ball half-heartedly while Lily picked dandelions in silence. When they stopped for ice cream on the way home, Lily looked up at him and asked if Mommy was mad again. Jack looked into her soft brown eyes, Claire's eyes, and felt the sting of something deeper than betrayal. The children weren't just losing a mother, they were learning how love could vanish even when it used to fill a room. At home, Claire was already gone when they arrived. A note on the counter said she was out getting groceries. Jack checked the fridge. It was full. He stood there, staring at the shelves of untouched food, and wondered how long this had been going on. Not the affair, the exit. The gradual fade. The careful rewrites of truth that Claire told herself in silence. Had she convinced herself that Jack wouldn't notice? That the kids were too young to understand? But they did understand. Kids always do. They don't have the words for betrayal, but they feel its shape. Jack looked out the kitchen window, where the driveway sat empty. He wondered where she really was. Then he wondered how long he'd allow this charade to play out. Soon, he thought. Soon, she'll have to look me in the eyes. And when she does, she'll know I already saw it all. Saturday came with clear skies and a kind of early autumn air that usually brought the family together, jackets on hooks by the door, a hike planned, maybe hot cocoa waiting after dinner. But this Saturday, the silence in the house was louder than the wind rustling the leaves outside. Claire was gone before breakfast. She left no note this time. No excuse. Just the low murmur of the garage door rising at 7:12 a.m., and the fading rumble of her car as it disappeared down the street. Jack watched from the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee he hadn't touched. He counted the seconds until she turned the corner. Then he exhaled. The kids sat at the table behind him. Evan, stoic as ever, worked through a bowl of cereal while scrolling through his tablet. Lily sat cross-legged on her chair, poking at a stack of pancakes she used to love. Neither of them asked where their mother had gone. They already knew she wasn't coming back quickly. Or easily. The air around Claire had changed lately, charged with something Jack couldn't name. There was a restlessness to her movements, a sharpness to her sighs. She flinched when the kids asked too many questions. She grew irritated when Jack suggested they all spend a Sunday together. She seemed allergic to closeness now. As if their presence reminded her of the life she was already trying to escape. Jack noticed the way she checked her phone when she thought no one was looking. The way she smiled at it. The way that smile died when he entered the room. He noticed her new habit of keeping her purse beside her on the couch, zipped tight, like a vault. He noticed how she lingered in the garage after pulling in, just sitting in the driver's seat long after the engine cut off, staring straight ahead as though caught between two realities. The affair was not just physical. That much was clear now. She was slipping into someone else's world, piece by piece, lie by lie. And in the process, she was leaving them behind like luggage too heavy to carry. That afternoon, Jack cleaned the garage. Not out of boredom, but to think. To move. To burn nervous energy into something useful. As he sorted old tools and swept sawdust into neat piles, he caught sight of the paper bag again, the one with Dean's shirt inside. He pulled it out once more. It looked different in the daylight. Less like a weapon, more like a wound. A reminder. Not just of betrayal, but of the person Claire had become, someone careless enough to leave behind another man's shirt in a family car. Someone willing to risk everything and say nothing. Jack opened his phone and scrolled to Denton Auto Repair's Yelp page again. The reviews were mixed. Some praised Dean for his straight talk and down-to-earth attitude. Others hinted at poor customer service but never outright scandal. Jack clicked through the photos until he found another one, Dean leaning against a red Camaro, shirt half-buttoned, grin wide. He zoomed in. That same grin haunted him now. It was the kind of smile that had nothing to lose. The kind that stole more than time. Jack didn't know when Claire would come home. But when she did, he had decided there would be no confrontation. Not yet. Just presence. Just silence. The kind that forced a person to see what they'd become in the eyes of someone who still remembered who they used to be. Evening came. Jack made dinner, spaghetti, Claire's favorite, though he doubted she'd touch it. Evan helped grate the cheese. Lily set the table. Claire walked through the door at 6:48 p.m. without a word, without a glance. She paused in the entryway, sensing something unfamiliar in the air, a kind of stillness she couldn't manipulate. The scent of garlic, the clink of plates, the quiet presence of a husband and two children who had stopped waiting. Jack watched her closely. There was something in her eyes. Guilt, maybe. Or just annoyance at the weight of what she was pretending not to feel. She muttered a hello, kissed Lily's head absently, and sat at the table without touching her food. Dinner passed in fragments, small talk, forced smiles, the echo of a family still performing its routine. But the silence had changed. It no longer asked for answers. It made space for them. Claire had no idea that Jack knew. Not yet. But soon, the mask would crack. The next morning, Claire lingered in bed longer than usual. Jack lay beside her, eyes open, staring at the ceiling in the dim gray light of dawn. The silence between them wasn't new, but today it felt different, thicker, heavier. Like the air before a storm. He listened to her breathing, how it shifted when she turned her back to him, the bedsheets rustling like secrets. She didn't speak. Neither did he. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't spill over into something neither of them could take back. Later, after she left the room, he found himself staring at the imprint of her body on the mattress. A hollow space where warmth used to live. The days had become performance art. Claire moved through the house like a tenant passing through, never staying long enough to make contact. She made lunches but forgot to leave notes. She folded laundry but ignored the drawings Lily left on her pillow. She nodded when the kids spoke, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. Jack could see it in her eyes, the constant flicker of a life playing behind her eyelids that none of them were part of. Evan grew quieter. Lily started wetting the bed again. Jack didn't mention it. He simply changed the sheets in the middle of the night, whispering that everything was okay even though it wasn't. He held her small hands as she cried into his shirt, too young to explain what she felt, only old enough to know something was broken. Claire noticed the wet sheets, of course. But she said nothing. She just moved past them, past her daughter, past Jack, as if acknowledging the truth would set it in stone. Jack began documenting things. Not for court, not for leverage, just for himself. Dates. Times. Receipts. Mileage logs. Phone records when he could get them. Not to build a case, but to create a record of the truth, because living inside her lie had begun to erode his sense of reality. He found another receipt, this one for a dinner. Friday night. A steakhouse miles away from where she claimed she was meeting old co-workers for drinks. The timestamp was 8:34 p.m., the same hour she'd sent a text saying, "Still catching up, don't wait up." The receipt had 2 entrees. 1 dessert. Jack stared at the paper for a long time. It felt surreal. Like watching the slow, inevitable collapse of a building he helped design. You can see the cracks for months. You hear the groans in the foundation. But when it finally caves in, you're still surprised by how fast it falls. He didn't bring it up to her. Not that night. Not the next. But something changed in him after that. A quiet withdrawal. He began to pull back, not out of pettiness, but preservation. He stopped asking where she was going. He stopped offering to help. He cooked only for himself and the kids. He folded only his laundry. When she left in the morning, he no longer walked her to the door. Claire seemed to notice, but said nothing. And that was the clearest confirmation of all. The children, too, had begun to adjust. Or perhaps to mourn in their own quiet ways. Evan stopped setting a third place at the table unless Jack reminded him. Lily no longer asked when they'd go to the zoo with Mommy again. They were learning to stop hoping for things that never arrived. Jack started walking in the evenings after the kids were in bed. Just around the neighborhood, past the same hedges and fences and porch lights that had framed their life for over a decade. It calmed him. Helped him think. Sometimes he'd pass the empty park where they once pushed the kids on swings. Other times he'd find himself just standing on the corner, watching headlights in the distance, wondering if one of them belonged to her. One night, around 9:15, her car finally pulled into the driveway while he stood across the street, just behind the neighbor's birch tree. She sat in the car for 5 full minutes. No phone. No movement. Just stillness. When she finally stepped out, she looked different. Hair tousled. Lipstick faintly smudged. Her expression wasn't triumphant or guilty, it was blank. Hollow. The look of someone who'd used up every excuse they once believed in. Jack didn't approach her. He watched as she walked into the house, shoulders drawn tight, as though bracing for something that hadn't yet come. But it would. Soon, the weight of the truth would fall. Not like a storm, but like the slow, deliberate swing of a hammer. And Jack would be ready to catch the pieces. The beginning of the end came on a warm Wednesday afternoon, the kind that smelled like cut grass and distant barbecues, with sunlight pooling on sidewalks and kids riding bikes up and down the cul-de-sac. But beneath the soft light of that golden hour, something in Jack's world began to fracture, not in silence this time, but with a scream. Lily had been climbing the maple tree in the front yard, the one with low, inviting limbs and bark worn smooth by years of little hands. She loved that tree. It stood tall like a protector, its leaves whispering secrets whenever the wind moved just right. Jack had warned her to be careful, had even walked outside moments before to remind her not to go past the third branch. She'd nodded, smiling, cheeks smudged with chalk and joy. But Jack had gone inside to check on Evan, who was curled up on the couch under a blanket, his forehead warm to the touch and his skin pale. He'd been sluggish all day, barely touching his lunch, his usual spark dulled. Jack pressed the thermometer to his ear. 38.7, too high. He was just about to call the pediatrician when he heard it. The scream. Lily's voice, sharp and shrill, tore through the air like a siren. Jack dropped the thermometer and bolted out the front door barefoot, heart in his throat. She was lying on the grass, curled into herself, sobbing, her tiny body shaking with pain. Her right arm bent in a way that arms weren't meant to bend. Her leg scraped raw. Dirt streaked across her face. Jack knelt beside her, his voice calm despite the panic roiling inside. She was breathing. Conscious. But hurt. Badly. As he scooped her into his arms, Evan appeared at the front door, swaying like he might collapse. Jack's heart split in two, his son burning up, his daughter broken and bleeding. He carried Lily to the car with Evan following, sluggish and dazed. Jack didn't have time to think. He buckled them both in, started the engine, and peeled out of the driveway toward the nearest urgent care. Claire wasn't home. Jack had called her twice. No answer. He texted once, emergency. Call me. Nothing. He didn't bother again. At the clinic, the nurse's face changed the moment she saw Lily's arm. They brought her back immediately, wrapped her in a sling, gave her something for the pain. The X-rays confirmed a fracture near the elbow, not serious enough for surgery but painful enough to steal the light from her eyes. Evan lay curled in the waiting room, shivering, his cheeks now flushed with fever. The doctor looked at Jack carefully. "We need to monitor him closely," she said. "Could be viral, could be more. If the fever spikes or he becomes disoriented, bring him to the ER." Jack nodded, numb. They drove home after sunset, Lily half asleep against her window, arm in a temporary cast, her tears long dried but the pain lingering. Evan coughed weakly in the back seat. The thermometer in Jack's pocket read 39.4. When they pulled into the driveway, Claire's car was finally there. Jack didn't rush inside. He sat behind the wheel, watching the windows of the house, wondering if she'd even noticed they were gone. Wondering if she'd seen his messages. Wondering if she even cared. He carried Lily in first, carefully laying her on the couch and draping a blanket over her. Then he returned for Evan, helping him upstairs to his bed, placing a cool cloth on his forehead. The boy murmured something about missing his math test, then drifted into a restless sleep. Claire was in the kitchen when Jack came down. She was texting, her face illuminated by the blue light of her phone. She didn't look up until he opened the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water. She asked if everything was okay. Jack looked at her then. Really looked. The woman who had once rocked their children to sleep. The woman who used to laugh in the mornings over pancakes. Now standing there, a ghost wrapped in skin, eyes dulled by secrets, attention split between a glowing screen and the ruins of a life she was still pretending hadn't burned to the ground. He told her. Lily fell. Evan was burning up. The doctor had warned him to be ready for anything. Claire's face changed, but not in the way Jack expected. She looked shocked, yes, but not just by the news. There was guilt there, raw and trembling. Not the kind born from one moment, but from the weight of all the moments she hadn't been present. She asked if the kids were okay. Jack nodded once. then turned away. That night, as the house settled into quiet, Claire sat alone in the living room, her phone untouched for once. She stared at Lily's drawing still taped to the fridge, at Evan's science fair trophy on the shelf, at the family portrait above the fireplace, smiling faces in a frame that no longer matched the people inside. And Jack? Jack stood in the hallway, listening to the soft sounds of his children breathing in their sleep. Everything had changed. But the fall hadn't just broken Lily's arm. It had shattered something else. Something sacred. The illusion that this betrayal could stay hidden without consequence. Now the hurt was visible. Tangible. Wearing casts and running fevers. And Claire couldn't look away anymore. It was the kind of week that tested the edges of a man's strength, where every hour bled into the next, where sleep came in fragments and stress curled tight around the chest like a vice. Jack found himself waking before the alarm, eyes fixed on the ceiling in the gray stillness before dawn, wondering what would go wrong next. Evan's fever had broken 2 days ago, but he was still weak, pale, drifting through the house with the sluggishness of someone only half recovered. Lily was more animated, though the bulky blue cast on her arms served as a constant reminder of the fall. She couldn't dress herself, couldn't draw like she used to. Every time Jack knelt to help her tie her shoes or brush her hair, her silence said more than words ever could. Claire had tried. She was home more now, cooking half-hearted meals, hovering near the kids like a guest unsure of her place. She asked questions, offered help, gave them tired smiles. But her presence felt rehearsed. Like she was playing a version of the mother she once was. Jack didn't stop her. He let her try. But the warmth between them had turned cold. And then came the final crack. It was a Thursday morning, overcast and heavy with the promise of rain. Jack had barely managed 4 hours of sleep. He'd been up late catching up on reports he should have finished the night before. The architecture firm he worked for was small, lean, and under pressure. Projects were piling up. Deadlines were slipping. And Jack, usually a rock, had begun to falter. He'd been missing meetings. Showing up late. Forgetting details. The weight of everything at home had seeped into his work like water through drywall. And eventually, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. That morning, his supervisor called him in. The office was quiet, almost reverent in its silence. Jack sat across from the man, gray-haired, once a mentor, now a stranger holding a paper folder like it was a verdict. They spoke in calm voices. No anger. Just resignation. The words were sharp, but not cruel. Performance. Concerns. Personal matters affecting reliability. Position terminated effective immediately. Jack didn't argue. He nodded once, stood slowly, gathered the few things from his desk, a framed photo of the kids, a pencil holder, a leather notebook he hadn't opened in days. He didn't say goodbye to anyone on his way out. There was no anger. Just quiet. When he stepped into the parking lot, the clouds finally broke open. Rain poured in sheets, soaking him in seconds, but Jack didn't run. He stood there, keys in hand, eyes closed, face lifted toward the sky like he was daring the universe to try something else. He was already drowning. What difference did it make? By the time he reached home, the rain had slowed. His clothes were damp, his shoes heavy with water. He walked through the front door without a sound. Claire was in the kitchen, sorting mail. She looked up when she saw him, and for a moment, her expression softened, then shifted. She saw it in his eyes before he even spoke. "You're home early," she said, not unkindly. Jack set his bag down. Removed his coat. Looked around at the house that no longer felt like his. Then he simply said the words. "I was let go." Claire didn't speak right away. She put the envelope in her hand back on the counter and moved toward him, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to offer comfort anymore. Jack didn't stop her. But he didn't lean into her either. The job had been more than a paycheck. It had been structure. Identity. Something steady in a world that had grown unpredictable. Now, it too was gone. That night, the house felt smaller. The walls closer. Jack cooked dinner with less energy than usual. The kids could sense something had shifted again. Lily asked if they were in trouble. Evan asked if they'd have to move. Jack gave them reassurances he didn't fully believe. After they went to bed, Jack sat alone in the garage, lights off, the t-shirt still folded in its paper bag beside him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even broken. Just emptied. He thought about the years he'd given to that firm. The nights he'd stayed late. The holidays he'd missed. He thought about the years he'd given to Claire, the love he'd poured into a marriage she was now unraveling in secret. Everything was cracking. Everything. And yet, as he sat there, soaked in silence, Jack felt something shift deep inside him. Not despair. Not rage. Resolve. He had nothing left to lose. And sometimes, that's exactly when a man becomes most dangerous. 3 days after Jack lost his job, the rain came back, harder this time, relentless, as if the sky itself had found a reason to weep. The ground had already been soaked from the earlier storm, and the drainage system in their old neighborhood never handled back-to-back weather well. It started with puddles on the sidewalk, then pooling at the end of the driveway, and by Sunday night, the backyard was a shallow lake. But Jack didn't see it coming. Not the way it did. That Sunday afternoon had been quiet in the house, eerily so. The kind of quiet that didn't feel like rest, but like surrender. Claire had stayed upstairs most of the day, drifting between the bedroom and her phone, her expression unreadable. Jack barely saw her. The children were gone. They'd left that morning with Claire's mother, a last-minute arrangement. Lily needed more help with her arm than Jack could give, and Evan still looked pale around the edges. Claire suggested they go stay with their grandmother, just for a few days, and Jack hadn't fought it. Maybe, in truth, he needed the break more than he realized. When the front door closed behind them, the silence it left behind was different than the usual one. It wasn't tense. It wasn't angry. It was hollow. By evening, the rain intensified. Thunder rumbled far off, and the wind shook the windows in their frames. Jack stood in the living room, watching water collect at the base of the back porch steps. He made a mental note to check the basement. He never got the chance. Because by midnight, water was rushing under the door. It started as a slow seep, a dark, creeping stain across the hardwood, like a shadow spreading. Jack didn't even notice it until the cold soaked through his socks. By the time he grabbed towels and pushed them against the doorframe, it was too late. Water was pouring in from every side. The front, the back, the baseboards, the windows. The sump pump had failed. The storm drains outside were overwhelmed. The house was becoming a basin. Claire came downstairs barefoot, confused, still half asleep. She stopped at the foot of the stairs and stared at the living room floor, already ankle-deep. Jack didn't speak. He was moving, throwing rugs aside, lifting furniture, grabbing electrical cords out of reach. He told her to start grabbing towels. She blinked. Hesitated. Then moved without another word. For the next hour, they worked in silence, soaked to the knees, hauling things upstairs, stuffing blankets into cracks. None of it helped. The water didn't care. It kept rising. By dawn, the power was out. The downstairs carpets were ruined. Half the furniture was waterlogged. The house smelled of wet drywall and panic. When the rain finally slowed around 7 a.m., Jack stood at the top of the stairs, looking down over the soggy ruin of what had been their life centerpiece, the living room where they opened Christmas gifts, the dining room where Lily learned to read, the walls where Evan's drawings had once hung. Gone. Just like that. Claire stood beside him, arms crossed, damp hair clinging to her neck. Her face was pale. Tired. She looked like someone who had finally run out of places to hide. Still, neither of them spoke. Jack went outside and walked the perimeter of the house. Mud everywhere. The garden washed out. Lawn chairs overturned. A bird's nest scattered in the driveway like some metaphor the universe didn't even try to make subtle. He pulled out his phone and called his insurance agent. Left a message. Then called his neighbor, who brought over a wet vac and a portable heater. Jack thanked him quietly, unable to find more than a few words. The man gave him a sympathetic look and said, "Tough week, huh?" Jack just nodded. Claire didn't cry. Not when the rug floated away in the basement. Not when her wedding album was found soaked through and stuck to the floor. Not even when the drywall in the kitchen began to sag under the weight of absorbed water. But Jack could see it in her, the crumbling beneath the surface. This wasn't just a flood. It was exposure. With the children away, the storm had stripped the house bare. No noise to cover their distance. No distractions to buffer the silence. Only water, rising around them, seeping into every corner of their foundation, softening the walls they had built between themselves for years. Jack stood in the middle of the wreckage, soaked to the skin, heart heavy but oddly clear. They couldn't live like this anymore, not literally, not emotionally. And Claire knew it too. He saw it in her eyes when they finally met his, just as the last of the rain began to fade and the morning light pressed through the cloud cover. The flood hadn't just damaged the house. It had drowned the illusion. There was no more pretending. The house dried, but the silence didn't. After the flood, everything slowed. The rain stopped. The cleanup began. Neighbors dropped off food. A local contractor came to assess the damage. Claire handled the calls while Jack patched what he could, ripping out baseboards, hauling soaked drywall into the yard, disinfecting the basement with bleach and rage. The children stayed with Claire's mother longer than planned. Lily's cast would come off in 2 weeks, and Evan still needed rest, the doctor said. But Jack knew it wasn't just about recovery. Claire hadn't asked to bring them home. Neither had he. It was easier this way. Quieter. Like waiting for something to end without having to say it out loud. On Monday, Jack stood in the garage, staring at the paper bag on the shelf. Dean's t-shirt. Still there. Still folded. A silent witness to everything that had unraveled. He hadn't told Claire he knew. Not yet. Not in words. But he didn't need to. Every movement between them now had weight, as if they were both standing on a cracked sheet of ice, afraid to speak for fear of falling through. She was softer with him now, but not in love. More like someone who feels sorry for the person they've hurt. She asked if he was sleeping. If he needed anything. If he wanted her to make coffee. He said yes to all of it, not because he wanted to be cared for, but because he wanted her to hear herself say those words. Claire cooked more. Cleaned more. She hovered like a ghost trying to finish unfinished business. But Jack could feel the strain in her voice. The unsaid truths curling like smoke in the space between every sentence. One night, a full week after the flood, she came into the living room while he was sitting on the floor, repairing a warped photo frame from their bedroom. The one with their wedding picture. Claire sat across from him, folding laundry she hadn't touched in days. Her eyes fell on the photo. Jack kept working. She reached for it, but he turned it slightly away. Not out of anger. Just finality. A small gesture that said, no. This is mine now. Claire swallowed hard. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded one of Evan's t-shirts, red with a faded superhero logo. She held it for a second longer than she should have. Then placed it neatly in the basket. That night, as they climbed into bed, Jack didn't say goodnight. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, while Claire turned off the lamp and curled away from him, her breath shaky, her silence louder than it had ever been. The next morning, the sun came through the windows in clean, unbroken lines. Jack rose early, made coffee, stepped into the backyard. There was a stillness in the air. Not peace, just the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has said all it has to say. And that was when he decided. It was time. Not for a confrontation fueled by anger. Not a question. Just the truth. He walked back inside, went to the garage, and pulled the paper bag from the shelf. He brought it to the kitchen, set it on the table, and left it there. Claire came down an hour later, freshly showered, her hair still damp, tied back loosely. She poured coffee, eyes on the cup, and only noticed the bag when she turned. Her body froze. Jack didn't move. He just looked at her. And for the first time in months, Claire didn't look away. Her hand hovered over the paper, hesitating, trembling slightly before she reached in and pulled the shirt out. She unfolded it. Stared at it. The color drained from her face. Jack still said nothing. Because he didn't need to. Everything was in front of them now. The betrayal. The silence. The years of erosion. And the flood had washed away the illusion that they could outrun it. Claire gripped the shirt tighter. Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She sat down slowly. And the truth finally filled the room, quiet, undeniable, and heavy enough to break the last of whatever still remained between them. Claire didn't deny it. She didn't lie. Didn't gasp. Didn't reach for some twisted version of the truth to soften what Jack already knew. She simply sat there, across the kitchen table from him, holding the wrinkled shirt of another man, the man who had been living in the margins of their marriage, and lowered her head. Her silence was an admission. The air between them shifted. It didn't explode. There were no raised voices. No slammed doors. Just the quiet collapse of a story that had run out of pages. Jack waited. Not for an apology. He didn't need one. He wasn't sure he would believe it even if she gave it. What he needed now wasn't closure, it was clarity. And it was already here. Claire finally spoke, and her voice was thin. Hollowed out. She said it started with the car. She said Dean was kind, attentive, knew how to look at her like she was still someone worth looking at. She said it felt harmless at first, harmless enough to laugh, to linger, to tell herself it wasn't cheating if she still came home at night. But somewhere between oil changes and engine checks, something gave way. She said she hadn't meant to fall. That it wasn't love. That she hadn't been planning to leave, at least not yet. Jack listened. He didn't interrupt. He sat still and let her speak, not for her, but for himself. He needed to hear the shape of the thing that had lived between them all this time, this shadow that had stretched over their house, over their children, over their bed. When she finished, she looked at him, not with hope, not with expectation, but with resignation. And Jack stood. He didn't yell. He didn't ask why she did it. He just said 2 words. It's over. Claire blinked once. Nodded. A single tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Jack left the room. Walked upstairs. Packed a bag, not because he was running, but because she needed to leave, and he wanted her to see what absence felt like. He took nothing sentimental. Just clothes. A toothbrush. His wallet. On the way out, he paused in Lily's room. The cast she'd outgrown lay on the shelf like an artifact. He touched it briefly, then moved to Evan's desk, where a half-solved Rubik's Cube sat beside a stack of science flashcards. They didn't know yet. But they would soon. Jack drove to his sister's house 2 towns over. She'd offered the guest room weeks ago, sensing something was wrong before he ever said a word. When she opened the door and saw the overnight bag in his hand, she didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside and hugged him tight, and Jack, for the first time in months, let himself exhale. That night, He lay on a clean mattress in a quiet room, alone but unburdened. And for the first time in a long time, he slept. A week later, he returned to the house, not to move back in, but to sit down with the kids. Claire had told them he was away for work, but they were old enough to see through it. Evan asked first. "Is this about Mom?" Jack nodded. Lily held his hand the whole time. He told them the truth, just enough for their age. He told them people make choices. Sometimes bad ones. He told them none of this was their fault. That they were loved. That no matter what changed, he was still their father, and he wasn't going anywhere. Claire stood in the doorway, watching, silent. She had lost something she would never get back. Jack didn't take pleasure in that. But he didn't soften it either. In the weeks that followed, the separation became formal. The house, still damaged from the flood, was listed for sale. Jack found a small rental close to the kids' school. Claire moved in with her sister. The logistics were messy, but the direction was clear. Jack began to rebuild, not just his surroundings, but himself. He started running again. Ate better. Saw a therapist. Spoke more kindly to himself in the mirror. Each day, a little stronger. Each day, a little farther from the man who once slept beside someone who was already gone. The children adjusted. Slowly. Evan asked hard questions. Lily drew pictures of their old house with 2 separate bedrooms. Jack kept them all. He didn't forget what happened. But he forgave himself for not seeing it sooner. Because in the wreckage of betrayal, he found something worth saving. His own dignity. His voice. His peace. And that was more than enough. Not all endings are explosions. Some are quiet. Slow. Like water rising through the cracks until everything you thought was solid floats away. But when the flood comes, and the foundation gives, you don't rebuild for her. You rebuild for yourself. Because the man who walks away with nothing but his truth, he walks away whole.